So this phenomenon of lynching is a horrible thing, right? There's no other way to kind of say it. You sort of see some aspects of it, but I want to conclude by kind of talking briefly about lynching, what it was, what it wasn't, and maybe even some surprising aspects of lynching, right? What it was, what it wasn't, and some perhaps surprising aspects of lynching itself. You've seen the images in front of you, and we have the context of Reconstruction to kind of build from. Lynching is something that's difficult to define. Even those that were trying to fight against it are going to have trouble defining this term. Now, I'm going to just tell you how I kind of stumbled across this concept. I had heard about it before, but I thought about really writing my dissertation about this subject. It really became so fascinating to me that folks, as we're becoming modern, are doing such kind of barbaric things to each other. It really sort of troubled me in certain ways. I was in grad school thinking about lynching and reading everything I could about lynching, and then suddenly a lynching happened. In 1998, a lynching happened. A guy named James Byrd got lynched in Jasper, Texas in 1998, and I was like, what in the world? Because I'd just been reading about all these lynchings from the 1890s. And then all of a sudden, this lynching happened in 1998. Basically, what happened was this. James Byrd, this African-American guy, is walking home. These guys drive by in a truck, right? They kind of beat him up, grab him. They will put a chain on him, attach the chain to the back of their truck, and they drive throughout Jasper, Texas, until James Byrd is dead. So we labeled this a lynching because it was multiple people doing the killing, this kind of violent, like overkill, like ritualistic kind of killing. By definition, lynching is kind of this ritualistic form, not just killing someone, but like torture. Right? So it's kind of overkill. Psychologists will tell us that there's something going on when there's this extra overkill. Not just I hate you, I'm going to kill you. Right? There's something happening psychologically. Maybe some of you psych majors can sort of help us wrap our minds around what might be happening, what might be going on in such a case, right? In such a case. So this really, caught my attention, not just because I'm a weirdo that likes violence, but because I think that, pulling out the significance of this in certain ways is a fruitful exercise, right? It's a fruitful exercise. What I want to do is talk a bit about this lynching and what it is, and some of the things I discovered about it surprised me, in fact. I think I have a few of these handouts, and if not, I can pull it up on the screen here in a second. There's a lot written on this subject, so I ended up reading like 200 books and articles on this, trying to wrap my mind around what in the world might be going on in this time period with this phenomenon of lynching. It tips in the post-Reconstruction period, right? It tips near the end of Reconstruction here, especially once the troops are removed. By definition, a lynching is like a ritualistic killing by 2 or 3 or more persons, right? But there's some problems with the definition itself. Okay, what if it's 2, not 3? Does it count? Right. So, historically, there are even some difficulties in terms of the numbers. How many lynching victims do we even have? It's hard to sort of quantify. Some have said, okay, it's around 5,000 people lynched between 1880 and 1930. Somewhere in that range. Others say, no, the numbers are much higher than that. It's at least 15,000 people killed. Ida Wells, who's going to be one of the more important anti-lynching activists, will say that it's much higher than that. It's at least 15,000 people that are going to be killed. Many of them we'll never know because many of them are not counted. Many of them are not counted, especially if they're burned. There is no body. Right? Oftentimes the coroner would show up and just say, well, we don't know what happened. We know somebody might have been killed, but we don't know who did it. Now, we know that that's ridiculous. Why do we know that? Well, folks took selfies. Right? Folks took evidence on themselves. So we know that people who was involved, and often they were not prosecuted. Right? That's another big part of this is this idea that prosecution, right? They will evade prosecution in a certain way. Some will say maybe that's the most important part of this, not just that folks are going to be killed, but that these folks would not be prosecuted because that almost says that the society says it's okay. So lynching is often considered a form of extra-legal violence. It's violence done outside of the justice system. But I would actually question that, because if the society is not prosecuting people, it's almost condoning it. It's almost condoning it. So keep that in mind too, in terms of some of the conflict that we see coming out of this period around issues of race. We see a lot of conflict in this period around issues of race, around gender, and around class. But in this case, you can definitely argue that both race and gender are going to be involved. So look at this first quote. These quotes are from a historian of the South by the name of Leon Litwack. Leon Litwack has done a lot of study in the Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction South, and he had a chapter in his one of his books on lynching, and he came up with the following kind of definition of lynching. Because I usually would ask you what you know about lynching or what you've heard about it and what his definition means to you, but instead I think we'll just go into his definition. Right? Litwack says, excuse me, and some of this is graphic, so again, if this is not something you can handle, I understand. The story of a lynching, then, is more than the simple fact of a black man or woman hanged by the neck. It's the story of slow, methodical, sadistic, often highly inventive forms of torture and mutilation. So again, it's about the overkill. It wasn't just about killing. It's about this kind of torture aspect as well. If executed by fire, because hanging was a major form of lynching, but there were other forms of killing people. It's really any way of group killing people, including burning them to death. If executed by fire, it's the red-hot poker applied to the eyes and genitals. Now, you psych majors are going to have to help me understand this. One of the major aspects of lynching tended to be focusing on the genitals. Castration. Getting a stomach ache just thinking about it. But cutting off the male parts. You'll notice in many of these pictures, people's pants are down, or their zippers undone. That sort of usually shows you that castration was a part of that ritual. Yes? So this dehumanization aspect is a major part of this, and I think you're right. I think you're right. And a couple of these examples, I think, are going to prove exactly that. Think about what we've just negotiated in terms of Reconstruction. Folks are arguing that they're equal. Well, this is going to be a way to say, no, you're not. Right? No, you're not. And I think it's clearly dehumanization. I think you're exactly right, and I'll show you exactly what we mean in one of the later examples here. Don't read ahead, because some of these are super rough, and I want to set them up for you. As the body slowly roasts to the flames and the blood sizzles in the heat, I'm going to read them fast because some of these are super nasty. If executed by hanging, it's the convulsive movement of the limbs, whether by fire or rope. It's the dismemberment and distribution of severed bodily parts as favors and souvenirs to participants in the crowd. Now, you psych majors, we need you again. What in the world is going on here? It's one thing, I would say, to hate someone so much to kill them. It's a whole nother animal to cut off pieces of their body. Take them home with you. Or even as I've read about, the crowd fights over them. Oh, give me that finger. That's my... think about what's going on here. Like, literally dehumanization. Right? You're literally taking people apart and kind of butchering them. This notion of superiority. Almost some would compare it to notions of hunting and kind of the conquest of that, but that's over an animal, right? So again, your dehumanization point comes up again, this notion of superiority. Distribution of several bodily parts as favors and souvenirs to participants in the crowd: teeth, ears, toes, fingers, nails, kneecaps, bits of charred skin and bones. Such human trophies might reappear as watch fobs or be displayed conspicuously for public viewing. The severed knuckles of Sam Hose, for example, would be prominently displayed in the window of a grocery store in Atlanta. This Sam Hose case is a really important one. This was one of the bigger lynchings of the time. At the turn of the century, I think it's 1899. Sam Hose was a worker. He and his boss got into some trouble, and they ended up fighting each other. Right? Sam Hose won, and the boss was killed. Now, the way the story got told was very different than the way things actually happened. Right? They had an employer-employee dispute. Sam Hose killed him. That's true. The way the story got told, though, was quite different. People told stories about Sam Hose sneaking up on his boss in the dead of night and burying an axe in his back like a coward and then raping his wife. Didn't happen. But that's the way the story got passed around, especially through media, right? What happened? Oh, really? In Sam Hose's case?
Because she doesn't testify because she's too weak of constitution or something. And his mother mother is the one. I mean, her mother is the one who identified that he was the killer, even though she wasn't there, and she has never seen him. There was no mask or anything. There's a video on it.
Yeah, I have to find it. I haven't seen it, but I think I've heard something. I need to check that out. Let me know if you know that citation. But think about, especially the role of media and how this will be spread. Again, think about those newspaper articles that are going around. This will create a kind of national audience in a sense, right? So much larger than the small town it might be happening in. It's almost creating a national imagined community. As will sending these postcards around the country. If you look at some of the pages, they look at the back of the postcards, right? People are saying things like, look at the Negro barbecue we had, or look at what we did this weekend, right? It's almost creating this national kind of community. Now, this case is also significant for another reason. There's a really important figure in American history by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. Some of you may know this figure, W.E.B. Du Bois. He's considered one of the founders of American sociology. He's a prominent historian. He was the first African American to get his PhD from Harvard. He was one of the founders of the NAACP. This really important figure. Well, he lived in Atlanta at the time. He was a college professor, a young college professor at the time. So there's this story about W.E.B. Du Bois. And he is, at the time, hears about the Sam Hose case. And they are threatening to lynch Sam Hose. The way most lynchings happened was someone was accused of some form of violation of Jim Crow, whether a crime or you could get lynched for being uppity, being disrespectful. You could get lynched for looking someone in the eye. You could get lynched in the Jim Crow South for not stepping off the sidewalk as an African American person, as a white person. That was considered disrespectful. So Du Bois hears about that. Well, normally what happens is you get thrown in jail at that point. And often the mob would come to the jail and take the person out and just lynch them. Rather than waiting for them to go through the justice system, they kill them publicly, right? That often happened right outside the courthouse in the case. So Du Bois hears about Sam Hose and he's like, man, they're going to lynch him. They're going to lynch him. So he's like, what can I do? He starts writing an article about how lynching is horrible, how it's not only horrible for the victim, but it's actually a threat to our republic because we don't respect our own justice system, right? The society is threatening to collapse. He's writing all these kind of highfalutin concepts, let's say, and he's so happy with himself. He finally finishes the article. He takes it off the typewriter, and he's walking downtown to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution to try to hurry up and get it published to save Sam Hose's life. But as he's walking through the town, he sees Sam Hose's knuckles on display in the grocery store. He knows it's too late. Now, this is going to be a tipping point in the life of W.E.B. Du Bois because he decides at that point he can't just be a college professor anymore, that he has to do something more. He decides to leave. He ends up moving to New York and is going to be one of the founders of the NAACP, which still exists, one of the oldest civil rights organizations. So this is going to have a number of implications, but think about how the case itself is so kind of significant, right? So significant. The second quote here, I'm not going to read it all because this one is interesting. The second one is, they got switched in order. But the second one is actually from a book from the 1400, a book about the 1400s. A French philosopher by the name of Michel Foucault wrote a book called Discipline and Punish about the birth of the modern prisons. In this book, he talks about 15th century France and how when they're switching from the monarchy to more other forms of government, right, how things are going to change in terms of punishment. Punishment used to be done publicly. He argues punishment used to be done publicly, but as we become more modern, we put punishment behind closed doors. We build prisons, right? So we don't have to see and kind of deal with the punishment as more fair and just and these sorts of things. So he describes this kind of public punishment that was happening in 1400s France. Now, what I think is interesting is it was so similar to a later case here. I don't know which one is correct on yours, but the one about Luther Holbert, on my handout is number 3, but on here it's number 4. So the one that says apprehended for allegedly killing his white employer, look at that example. Apprehended, because I think it's so similar to number 2, first of all. Apprehended for allegedly killing his white employer, Luther Holbert and his wife found themselves subjected to mob justice in Doddsville, Mississippi in 1904. Some 1,000 people stood and watched as the self-appointed executioners went about their business, engaging in the increasingly familiar ritual torture, mutilation, and murder. So first of all, the fact that it's increasingly familiar, right? right? It's almost common. Some people knew what to expect with a lynching. If you look at these stories, they sound so familiar. The ritual was so like repetitive. It often went something like this. Someone's accused of a crime, right? The mob gets them, maybe takes them out of jail. Often the sheriff just will hand them the keys and say, here, go take them, deal with them. There are some examples of sheriffs that are like, no, you can't have them, right? There's one example I remember in particular where a sheriff was like, look, I don't care if there's 10,000 of you out there, the first man that steps on this, across this line, I'm going to shoot you. Right? And so the crowd was like, dang, okay, and they go home. they let the justice system do what it's going to do. But most of the time, sheriff's like, here you go, he's in cell number 3. Oftentimes, sheriffs join the mob. So you have this kind of complicity of law enforcement at the time that's problematic. If you think about how is the society supposed to function. Well, this ritual is basically this. They would take the person out and start torturing them. Often they would torture them and try to force a confession. So they take the victim and stab him like, well, you raped so-and-so, right? You're like, no, I wasn't even in town that day. Stab him again. You sure you didn't rape such and such? We heard it was you. I wasn't even here visiting my mom. I can prove you. Stab you again. Did you rape him? Cut you again. Cut off an ear. Did you rape? Yeah, okay, I did it. Whoever you said I raped, I did it. Right? Eventually, you're going to confess. It's torture. Why does the mob even have to do that? Right? Why is that even necessary? One, when they already know they're going to kill the person. Number two, when they often knew that the person was not guilty of anything. Psychologically, perhaps something's happening. I don't know. Maybe you all can have an idea about that confession. To be satisfied?
Yeah, so see, you could do it. That's why I did all this.
So it's this kind of it's almost a self-fulfilling sort of prophecy. Remember when we talked about the Salem witch trials? This notion of the confession as being the only thing that can kind of end your torture? It's really interesting to see at that point how that may happen. Actually, lynching is interesting in that sense because folks were almost disappointed if they killed them too quick. Right? So you might hang somebody, but wait, don't let them die yet, right? Cut them down or stab, but don't kill them. Right? So you had folks that were stabbed, had body parts cut off, or hanged, were partially burned, and then shot hundreds of times. Like the overkill.
It's used as entertainment. A lot of people, thousands of people just come around and watch it.
If you look at some of these pictures, and these were the ones I became most interested in, there was something called spectacle lynchings. Spectacle lynchings. And what a spectacle lynching was one of these lynchings that's done publicly, and thousands of people show up. There were some that attracted 10, 20,000, 30,000
people around are smiling and laughing and then just like pointing
pictures. One historian compared it to reality TV or going to an NFL game. Suddenly you have this imagined community of people. Now, does everyone think the person did it? No. But we know how the mob mentality works too. Right? What if you're in that crowd of 20,000 and you're like, no, this is wrong? Every now and then that's the case, but you better be quiet, right? Because, we'll throw you up there too. Right? There's a certain peer pressure also involved in this. And I think all of that is important. The psychology, the sociology of all of this. But these spectacle lynchings in particular, right? Think about the power of the visual. And people are participating but also watching. They're really still participating. I think that visual power is really, really important. I remember reading about one example in 1911 in Kentucky. They lynched a guy on stage inside a theater. They sold tickets, brought him on the stage, and lynched him. Right? Think about that visual performance aspect of it and how people are participating. Stories are interesting as well because what's the justification given for lynching? What's the major reason given, the one that could really draw out the biggest crowds? Fear of rape. Supposedly, the freedmen, after slavery, became a bunch of rapists. Now wait, we just saw the Ethnic Notions video. What were slaves supposedly like? They're happy, singing, childlike, right? Non-threatening. Even the coon, the free blacks, earlier, happy, stupid, but they're not rapists, right? During the Civil War, when most white Southern men are away from the plantation, they weren't rapists then when they could have been. Suddenly, in the 1890s, the stereotype shifts. Right? And the idea is, okay, you got to do something to stop, and you got to protect womanhood because women are fragile, they can't deal with this. And what's also interesting is kind of the contradictions behind that. There's this notion that women shouldn't be subjected to violence, but what do? They They bring women to the front of the mob to watch the lynchings. Little kids were brought. Yeah, 4 and 5-year-old kids brought up to the front. They watch while they cut off his fingers. I was like, what's going on with this, right? You're not protecting children and women from this. You're exposing them to it. I argue that something else was really happening, and we can use imagined community to understand it. It was partially about these freedmen, but it was also about the crowd.
It's
about
also
controlling them.
teaching the future generation how they want them to be treated, like enculturation. That's like
Exactly. It's about a socialization. How do you learn your place in society? How do you learn about race? Think about these poor whites that are watching. Man, I'm so glad I'm not that guy. You may have everything else in common with that person, but you do not want to be that person, right? This is a mechanism of separating folks. It's also a mechanism of controlling white Southern women. Think about what white women are doing in this period between the 1890s and 1920. They're pushing for the right to vote. They're saying, no, I'm going to work outside the home. I don't want to rely on your salary. Right? They're acting in non-traditional ways. Many men are freaking out. Like, man, what's going on? Freedmen are all free. Women are acting crazy. They want jobs and stuff. Some argue that lynching is a result of that. Right? So rape in particular will be the major justification used to justify lynching. One Southern feminist by the name of Rebecca Felton says that if you need to lynch 1,000 black men a day to keep white Southern women safe, you should do so. Now, some are going to take this up. There's a lady named Ida Wells, probably the most important anti-lynching activist, Ida Wells. Ida Wells is African American. Ida Wells talks about she believed in the myth of the black male rapist. Ida Wells writes a letter to Frederick Douglass, and she's like, man, if they're doing this to people that are lynching folks like this, they must have done something. They probably did rape somebody. But in 1892, Ida Wells has a tipping point. In 1892, 3 of her best friends get lynched. And she's like, wait a second. Her 3 good friends get lynched, and she knows that they're not rapists. She knows they're not criminals. In fact, they're businessmen. They own a grocery store. She was godmother to one of their kids. She's like, wait a second. I got to rethink this whole thing. She will become an investigative journalist, and she will investigate thousands of lynchings. And she found some interesting things. One of the things she found was an interesting statistic. Again, the overwhelming justification given for lynching was to stop black male rape. Right? But Ida Wells found that in only 18% of all lynching cases, only 18% were the victims even being accused of rape. So basically, in 82% of lynching cases, they weren't even talking about them as rapists. They were considered committing some other kind of crime or violation, right? If you look someone in the eye, if you argue with your employer, if you try to vote. So she's like, this is BS. This is not about rape at all. In fact, she writes an article that says, you know what, this is about controlling, especially interracial sexual relations. She writes an article and says, you know what, these white men are going to find that white women are making certain choices. Right? They might like Denzel. Denzel might like, I'm trying to think of an actress or something. They are getting along across the racial line. Right? This is so outrageous to some that when she publishes that, they threaten to lynch her. They burn down her press. They chase her out of Memphis, Tennessee, where she lived. She's going to relocate to New York and Chicago and continue fighting against lynching for the rest of her life. But it's important because it kind of demystifies this whole myth of the black male rapist that was prevalent at the time. Now, a couple of important things, and I know you're tired, so I'll give you a break here in 1 second. There are some important aspects of lynching and some surprising aspects of lynching. That Luther Holbrook case is interesting because, once again, it was an employer-employee issue. But if you keep reading that, you see that both Luther Holbrook and his wife get lynched. Now, my whole thing is, okay, if this is about black male rapists, why you lynch his wife? You're going to see that this is a lot of this is going to be BS. A lot of this is going to be BS. Many women will be lynched. I want to talk about that because I think it undermines the whole idea of the institution of lynching in a sense. But also, lynching was not always about black people. It's not always about black people. Before 1865, it was rare to lynch a black person. Why? Why do you think it might be rare to lynch a black person before 1865? Why might that be the case? Any guesses? They were labor. And in particular, there were slaves. If you lynched someone's slaves, you had to pay them. Even if the government executed your slave, you had to pay them. So they found other ways to punish, of course. They cut off fingers and did things. They tended not to lynch them. By the 1880s and 1890s, lynching becomes 90% African American, 90% Southern. But the fact that it shifts around Reconstruction, to me, is really interesting. Before 1880, most victims of lynching were non-black victims. You got white Republicans that got lynched, and of course in the West, Mexican Americans get lynched. Asian Americans get lynched here in California. Utah, 1882, there was a major case of lynching of Asian American laborers. It's still about controlling labor. It's still about this notion of citizenship being defined. But it's not mostly about African Americans. It becomes by the 1890s an overwhelmingly Southern phenomenon and an overwhelming African American phenomenon, but it doesn't start that way. To me, again, that shows that race is constructed. It changes over time. It shifts depending upon what people are afraid of at that time. Lynching was a national institution. I read about lynchings in Pennsylvania, right? Lynchings in the West, but it does become overwhelmingly Southern by the 1890s, especially after Reconstruction. So the fact that it changes to me is interesting and significant, and made me think a lot. But that gender question is really, really interesting. How do we understand the lynching of women? If this is all about controlling black male rape, then why are you lynching women? Doesn't make any sense. If this is all about protecting women, how do you justify lynching them? Well, in many cases, the African American women that are lynched, you'll see a few examples there, are usually related to a male. So let's say the lynch mob shows up at your house. Hey, where's Saquon? I don't know where he is. Like maybe you're hiding me, or maybe I've run away. Right? We don't know where he is. Okay, we're going to take you. So they take my mom and lynch her. They take my sister and lynch her. Often that was the case, my wife or whatever. Right? So you could be a stand-in for some male, but also some women who seem to be acting like men might be treated like men. Now I got to give you one example here. I got to put another disclaimer. This is the most horrible example I think I've ever come across. It has to do with a lady named Mary Turner. It's the fourth example on this handout. I'm going to go through it, but it's horrible. It's horrible. If you need to cover your ears, understand that that's fine. This has to do with a pregnant woman. Right? Just want to put that out there. What's the backdrop of this story? Well, basically what happens is in 1918, Mary Turner's husband gets lynched. Mary Turner's husband gets lynched. And Mary Turner is not having it. Her husband gets lynched and she's like, oh, heck no, I'm going to prosecute everyone involved. You're all going to jail, right? Mary Turner says, I'm free. Right? This is right after World War I. Right? As we just finished fighting to make the world safe for democracy, this lynching happens. Her husband is killed and she's like, everybody involved is going down. And so the crowd says, what did you say? She says, you heard me. I'm a citizen. Everybody involved is going to be prosecuted. And so the mob turns its attention to her. So this is the case. Mary Turner, in her 8th month of pregnancy, vowed to find those responsible, swear out warrants against them, and have them punished in the courts. For making such a threat, a mob of several hundred men and women determined to teach her a lesson. After tying her ankles together, they hung her from a tree head downward. Dousing her clothes with gasoline, they burned them from her body. While she was still alive, someone used a knife ordinarily reserved for splitting hogs to cut open the woman's abdomen. The infant fell prematurely from her womb to the ground and cried briefly, whereupon a member of the Valdosta, Georgia mob crushed the baby's head beneath his heel. Hundreds of bullets were then fired into Mary Turner's body, completing the work of the mob. Okay. Obviously, rape had nothing to do with it. Obviously, guilt or innocence had nothing to do with it. What's Mary Turner's crime? She's acting like a citizen. She's refusing to be treated as anything less than a citizen. And I would argue that especially the fact that she's a woman acting this way enrages the crowd. And so you see what happens here. So obviously this is not about guilt or innocence. They know she's not guilty of anything. Definitely know the unborn child is not guilty of anything. Your earlier point about dehumanization, I think, fits perfectly in this example. Look at how she's treated. She's literally butchered with the same knife used for butchering animals. This is exactly how she's being treated. So I think this case, among many, signifies so many different things. Right? Signifies so many different things. Think about the conflict and the controversies and the difficulties coming out of this period. I've read, stuff where they talked about lynch mobs being stereotypical. Right? Initially, the thought was that these were all poor whites in these mobs. Right? It was like poor white trash, quote unquote. Right? Not true. You had lawyers and doctors in these mobs. Right, often law enforcement, often ministers participating in the mob, which, again, throws you for a loop. I think there was something else really happening. I think to really understand this, like you said, we got to turn the camera around and look at the mob itself. I think there was a lot of social control that was happening, especially of these poor Southern whites, right, that may suddenly step out of line. You're not going to step out of line if you see something like this happening. Those white women, you're not going to step out of line if you see what happens in this case. And I think that there was a lot of control and power being exercised. It's not just about the lynching victim. And that's interesting, too, because, yes, it was about that victim, right? But it's not just about that victim. I've done presentations on lynching where after the fact, people are like, yeah, I had a great-grandfather who was lynched, and it terrorized the entire community, right? That was the point, right? The point is, man, you hear what happened? You better be at work on time tomorrow, right? It terrorized entire communities. But it also, I think, terrorizes white community, especially working class folks and women, or anyone that might step out of line. It's going to make you line up along lines of race, whether you want to or not. You kind of know that it's dangerous not to. I think that it's really a significant sort of exercise and explanation of things. Yes, it's about politics and economics at its base, but there's so much happening, right? There's so much kind of going on. Any questions about lynching? I wanted you to at least know what it is, even though it's horrible. I think that there's a lot to pull out of it. I think that it can help us especially understand some of the anxiety of the period, right? The conflict and tension, the way folks are freaking out, literally losing their minds, you could say, and how it's going to find expression in extreme forms of violence. Extreme forms of violence. Anything unclear? I know I kind of went through that quick. There's a lot in there. What it is. Yes?
How long did it take for the government to take action?
Great question. You all reminded me things I forgot when you asked questions, so it's good. The heyday of lynching is the 1890s. The high point is 1892. There are 230 verifiable lynchings in 1892, almost one a day. But in many cases, we'll never know what the true numbers were or how long it goes because often the numbers were counted. Usually the coroner would show up, look around, and say, well, this person died at the hands of persons unknown, or there's no body. I don't even know if a lynching happened. There's like a burn spot. That's all I know, right? So we'll never know. It's going to go well into the 1920s and 1930s. The numbers do start to go down in the 1920s and 1930s. Unfortunately, at the same time the number of individual lynchings was declining, the number of race riots was increasing. So, for example, in 1919, you have a race riot in Chicago, where the African-American population is going to be attacked, like not just one person, but the entire community, right? So in terms of like overall numbers, the violence actually increases. Right? What's the most famous lynching? 1955. 1955. A lynching of a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till. Emmett Till. Some of you may have heard of Emmett Till. Emmett Till lived in Chicago. He lived in Chicago, but he had relatives in the Jim Crow South. He had relatives in Mississippi. So he goes south to visit his relatives. And he's not used to the Jim Crow South. He doesn't know how things work there. Not that the North is perfect. We've talked about racism in the North, right? But things are different there. For example, he goes to an integrated school in Chicago. So he's down in Mississippi, and he's showing off his pictures of his white friends. Yeah, I go to school with them. He's, oh, that's my girlfriend. They're like, what are you talking about? You're crazy. He's like, yeah, no, it's nothing, right? And they're like, okay, if you're not scared of white people, why don't you go say something to that white lady in the store? Now the report went that he went into the store and said "bye, baby" to the clerk, or whistled at her. Right? He comes outside and he's like, yeah, I told her "bye, baby." And there were some older men outside that are like, what'd you say? I said, yeah, I told the white lady, "bye, baby." They're like, you better get out of here. Like, what are you talking about? So that lady will come out of here and blow your head off. He's like, what? get out of here now. He leaves, he gets out of there. That night at his door, there's a knock at the door. Some men with guns are at his door. His uncle, he's staying with his uncle. They kidnap him. He's never seen alive again. He's going to be shot, beaten, badly disfigured. A cotton gin fan is tied to his body. They threw him in the river. By the time he's discovered, he's unrecognizable. His face is all bloated, shot. His mother, Amy Till, tries to identify him, and she's like, I don't know who that is. I can't identify that. I don't know if it's my son or not. She identified him by a ring he wore on his hand that had his initials on it. So she's like, oh my God, that is my son. These men they take him to court. I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny. They take him to court, and the men admit it. They're like, yeah, we killed him. They sold their story. In fact, one of the guys was the lady's husband and her brother-in-law. They sold the story to Life magazine for $3,000. They told why they killed him. But the all-white jury in Mississippi doesn't prosecute them. They get off. Last year, the woman involved says that none of this even happened. He didn't even say anything to her. On her deathbed, she admits that it never happened. Just last year, she died. Yeah, not too long ago. I want you to think about the implications of this, though. One of them is Emmett Till's mother. Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till, decides, I'm going to do something with this death. I'm going to make this significant. And so what she decides to do is to have an open casket funeral. Her friends and family are like, you cannot do this. Look at him. He's unrecognizable. She says, I want the world to see what they did to my boy. It's a 14-year-old kid. Right? Thousands of people come through the funeral in Chicago and see this. Magazines took pictures. You can Google before and after pictures of Emmett Till. It makes national and even international news. Millions of people actually joined the Civil Rights Movement in 1955 after seeing these pictures. 1955 is the same year as the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks, all of that, where a young minister by the name of Martin Luther King, who's only 25 years old, takes over that movement. So think about this connection between past and present, between first Reconstruction and the second, and how we're becoming modern, and some of the challenges and problems of becoming modern. So all this stuff is really kind of linked in a sense, but many consider Mamie Till a hero for what she had done. His uncle, Mose Wright, who was illiterate, he lived in Mississippi, testifies in court against the men. He points at them in court, which gets you lynched in 1955 Mississippi. They have to hide him out of state until it's time for him to testify, but he still testifies. So many consider him a hero as well. Right? He's going to put his life on the line, despite the fact that they're not prosecuted. Again, there's so much in this in terms of this lynching phenomenon. I'm not just trying to traumatize you. I want you to really think about the larger significance of this and what it's going to take. This is why many will argue a civil rights movement will still be necessary in the 20th century to sort of deal with what had not been resolved in the earlier period of Reconstruction. Okay? Whew, that's a lot. That's a lot. Yes?
Have you heard the song, The Strange Tree? Fruit grows in trees?
Strange Fruit. Yeah, there's a really good biography, documentary of the song. Some of you may have heard the song Strange Fruit. It's popularized by Billie Holiday in 1939. It was a song about lynching. Right? So strange fruit, like essentially people as fruit. Right? Really interesting history to this song. Really interesting history. If you get a chance to see this documentary, there's not a link to it yet, so unfortunately, actually I might be able to pull it up and link it to Canvas for you. But it's really interesting because although it becomes identified as an African American song, it was written by a white Jewish school teacher. He hears about a lynching, writes this poem called Strange Fruit. It gets made into music by Billie Holiday, and it's been remade several times, dozens of times, in fact. In fact, just a few years ago, Kanye West samples the song. And, this notion of strange fruit and kind of ongoing race issues. Right? Really interesting history to the song. We may get a chance to see part of it because it also talks about the Cold War era, which we're going to talk about. Okay, we got one last thing to talk about briefly, and I think it'll be a bit more uplifting, although it'll, I think, help illuminate this, but you all have been sitting forever. You're looking at me like you're about to revolt. Let's do a bathroom break real quick, and we'll finish up with what I want to show you and talk to you about. It'll be a lot lighter than that conversation, but I think we got to have that conversation first.